All right. Well, hey everyone, thank you for attending. Appreciate it. My name is Arian Ziafad. I'm a health, fitness, and performance and bodybuilding coach. Most people call me Zia because a lot of people just can't pronounce my name, so it just keeps things simple. But I've been in this space for about 10 years, roughly, focusing primarily on the hypertrophy space. Chris and I have known and worked with each other a couple of years now since I completed his mentorship, and I've been applying his principles to great effect with my clients. So I'm excited to break down some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, and glad to have you guys with us.
Good stuff. Obviously, everyone probably already knows who I am. If you don't, I'm not quite sure why you're here, but okay. So yeah, the plan for today is to talk through, as I said, the stimulating reps model, and then secondly, cover off how that applies in the context of caloric restriction. Um, shall we switch the chat off and jump straight into the model presentation?
Yeah.
Got a slide for you guys.
Let's bring this slide up.
We're going
That
to do
just kind
this
of
in,
breaks down
yeah, fantastic.
the model, and then we'll disable the chat. I'm still admitting people, by the way, so if I'm clicking
Okay.
away, that's why.
Okay, guys. So hopefully what you can see in front of you is a single slide showing how the stimulating reps model works in totality. Essentially, on the left-hand side, you've got a column of red text. And now that column of red text is the physiology that I keep talking about. So when I say, the stimulating reps model is a physiological model that explains how hypertrophy works, what I'm referring to is specific individual physiological observations. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got motor unit recruitment is a physiological concept. It's a physiological phenomenon that we understand, and it has implications for how strength training works. And that then feeds into the blue column on the right-hand side, which is the training variables, or some of the training variables, because I couldn't fit all of them in, but some of the training variables that are essentially going to be influenced by that specific physiological observation. So as I say, if we start with motor unit recruitment, what does motor unit recruitment actually do? Well, it actually governs how many muscle fibers are activated. Now we know we need to activate a muscle fiber to create a stimulus for hypertrophy in that fiber. So we know that higher recruitment is going to be better because it gives us access to more fibers and allows us to train more fibers. So when I look at a strength training program, and we look at the variables in that program, we go, how can I move towards a higher level of recruitment in the muscle fibers that I'm trying to train? Now, we know that rep range has an effect on the motor unit recruitment level. Heavier loads tend to allow us to achieve higher levels of recruitment because they're allowing us to reduce the amount of CNS fatigue from the disagreeable sensations, what we call supraspinal CNS fatigue. So I'm always going to drift towards using heavier loads, for example. So I've got rep range as one of my variables in my right-hand column. I also know that if my exercise is not very stable, I'm going to lose recruitment because I'm going to be devoting effort to concentration, to stabilization, and obviously I'm going to have more stabilizer muscles involved. So I'm not going to get as much recruitment in the target muscle. So again, I know that stability is going to be one of my training variables that impacts on recruitment. And then, of course, joint number is just a short way of saying how many muscle, how much muscle mass have I got involved in the exercise? Is it a multi-joint exercise with a lot of muscle mass, or is it a smaller amount of muscle mass? Am I going to choose a leg press over a squat, for example, for training, quads? So there's basically there's more training variables than that affect motor unit recruitment level, but that's just an illustration of how we can track through from physiology on the left-hand side through an understanding of the physiology in the middle of how that applies to strength training, to finally on the right hand side, how does that affect training variables? Now, I actually quite like this. I like the rep range example because Zia and I have talked a lot about this in the context of some of his clients because it doesn't always work out that you can use super heavy loads for everybody. But I'll let him kind of give some commentary on that now.
Yeah, it's funny because I can see a few of my clients on the call kind of nodding their heads in agreement with some of the statements you're making. Obviously, you're generally speaking going to want to try and limit fatigue by training in lower rep ranges, but that's not always practical. You're not going to shoot for a one rep in reserve on a, maybe a 6 rep set with a, say, like a dumbbell lateral raise versus maybe like a very stable squat pattern. So there's nuance here. The upper limit of rep ranges I tend to program tend to be 12 at the absolute maximum, but the range I seem to vacillate between is maybe 6 on the low end and 10 on the high end. But it's very much going to be determined by the movement pattern in question and how stable it is, and also the degree of difficulty in terms of executing that at a heavier load. Especially if some of my clients maybe don't have some of the tendon adaptations in place as well, I might start them on a higher rep range as well, just to be cautious, shall we say. I'm not going to have someone grab an 80-pound dumbbell and try and do dumbbell lateral raise with an 80-pound dumbbell right off the bat. So and then stability and obviously joint number, that kind of plays into that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the point is that we have a physiological model that helps us understand what we're aiming for in a perfect world, but we've got to kind of temper that with practical considerations and understand the
Mm-hmm.
trade-offs, of course. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like if we are, kind of having to drift up into those higher rep ranges, we may not necessarily get the same degree of recruitment that we would do with a slightly, heavier load. We just got to kind of see sort of, and we can come back to this later on when we talk about ways of increasing recruitment at various points in this presentation,
Mm-hmm.
just as a kind of kind of a way of mitigating that particular problem. But let's keep moving because I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because we've got some
Sure.
really good stuff for you guys coming up shortly. So secondly, we've got active mechanical tension, which is the driving force of the actual hypertrophy process inside each fiber. So we need to make sure that that is present, and that's largely determined by the speed of the fiber movement in the concentric phase, the shortening speed. And of course, that means basically we've got variables like proximity to failure and tempo, both of which will change the shortening speed. Of course, tempo is one of those things that, kind of it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, because if we do impose a tempo, we're probably not getting maximal recruitment. So we
Mm-hmm.
do have to be aware that that isn't really a way of maximizing hypertrophy. It just does maximize mechanical tension. So really, proximity to failure is the key one here. We don't really want to be going, 5, 6, 7 reps in reserve, like, there's some popular fitness influencers do tend to drift in that direction. I don't really want to be kind of aiming for, depending on the rep range, maybe 1 rep in reserve with the heavy or moderately heavy loads. And if you're kind of drifting up to that top end of the range that you were talking about a minute ago with 12
Mm-hmm.
rep maxes, I would probably be leaving 2 reps in reserve at that point, just because, it's the, kind of avoidance of calcium related fatigue for that,
Yeah.
kind of end of the spectrum. But
Mitigating
realistically,
fatigue accumulation as
yeah,
best you
it's
can.
just
Mm-hmm.
not really something we want to go into. In terms of other physiological, we've got variables. We've also got passive mechanical tension driving sarcomerigenesis.
Mm-hmm.
Not planning to talk about this very much because it's not something that more advanced bodybuilders really need to worry too much about developing. They've probably got most of the adaptations they're going to get. And of course, really that's driven by the range of motion and the resistance profile. I mean, sometimes people will go, oh, I'm doing this large range of motion exercise, therefore I'm expecting to get, some sarcomerigenesis, which is also called stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And they actually have the contractor position resistance profile. So the exercise is hardest in the contractor position, but because they've got a
Right.
large range of motion, they think they're getting a stretch kind of effect, and it doesn't work like that. You need to have high recruitment, so the fibers are actually activated in the stretch position in order to create passive mechanical tension during a strength training exercise. If you want to get passive tension from a stretch, then you can do that without activation, but that's a bigger range of motion than you're going to get from a strength
Yeah.
training exercise.
A lot of the evidence-based lifting guys, the younger boys, are doing stretch maxing right now. It's very
Yeah, it's
popular amongst
interesting to
them.
watch them actually. And I mean, fundamentally, they do understand the physiology. I mean, that is definitely true, and it's
Yeah.
really fascinating to see them, experientially understand the things that are going on in that circumstance, the enormous discomfort that you experience, which actually then drives improvements in motor unit recruitment. It's one of the strategies for increasing recruitment is actually to become more comfortable with those discomforting sensations. It'll actually drive an improvement in that way because of the way the psychobiological model of fatigue works. But that's a kind of a very sort of niche kind of thing that you can do. I don't think that's something that
Yeah.
everyone's going to do all the
If
time.
we were going to talk about discomforting sensations around stretching, my fiance persuaded me to go to hot yoga the other day, so I almost
Are you
cried.
still
But
recovering?
yeah, literally, I haven't been able to train the same ever since.
So keeping going, we've got neuromechanical matching, which is just deciding where the activation goes. Essentially, we're using the concept that activation will track the leverage. Another way of saying that the brain is always going to pick the muscles which are, kind of most efficient at doing a movement. And so, of course, exercise selection becomes a really big deal in terms of the bodybuilding training program. We're going to want to make sure that we cover as much of the muscle regions of the particular muscle group that we're trying to train with a
Hmm.
different selection of exercises. So exercise selection becomes really, really interesting when you bring neuromechanical matching in. It's one of those things I think is really exciting. I know a lot of people are pushing back on it, but it's a really cool way of making sure that if you've got two or three exercises in your program for a muscle group, they are actually doing different things, not exactly the same thing. I think that's a
Hmm.
pretty important feature.
Hmm.
In terms of the fatigue stuff, obviously, I talk about this all the time. You've got peri-workout, which is during the workout, and you've got post-workout fatigue. Peri-workout, we're just trying to avoid ending up with a reduced stimulus. We're trying to avoid reductions in active tension by creating calcium-related fatigue, and we're trying to reduce the disagreeable sensations that produce supraspinal fatigue. So, we're kind of, maybe looking at features like leaving a longer rest between sets. Maybe we're looking at
Hmm.
specific exercise selection to avoid getting wiped out by a set of heavy squats or multiple sets of heavy squats and then not being able to do anything very effectively for the rest of the workout. It's just about being sensible and sensitive to the fact that if we're experiencing these fatigue mechanisms. Like stretch position exercises, not going to put those first in a workout because then anything else after that isn't going to have very much mechanical tension being present. So just being
Yeah.
aware that those mechanisms exist and just structuring the workout in a way to avoid them. And the same thing goes for post-workout. We're just making sure that we don't have a ton of variables that are creating a lot of post-workout fatigue, because otherwise the next session isn't really going to be very effective. So obviously, we've talked about proximity to failure, the volume as well, the rep range, using lighter loads. We're not going to want to be able to train as frequently. And obviously things like resistance profile and range of motion are going to tie into that with the stretch activate ion channeling opening, producing a lot more calcium unrelated fatigue. So ultimately, this is just an illustration for you guys of how physiology and all of these things on the left, the red text on the left, these are all very well established physiological areas with a lot of research. There's nothing in here that is been made up or kind of sort of magical. It's all just basic textbook physiology that actually shows you how strength training variables are going to respond to the physiological reality that we're working with. Um, so that was really just kind of a presentation of the stimulating X model overall. Didn't want to spend too much time on that. I felt like we were starting to kind of get a bit bogged in on that, so I wanted to run through that quickly. I think
Hmm.
the next slide is the one that I'd like to focus on and talk through very carefully with you guys. So can we move on to that one and start
Yeah.
working through that?
I'm excited to break down some of these fatigue aspects as well. That'll be good to go over in the context of retaining muscle while in a deficit.
Fantastic. Okay, so what you've got here then, guys, is essentially a matrix showing a series of five factors in the column on the left, which are things that you're going to have to deal with in a period of caloric restriction. So when calories are below calorie balance, as in a dieting phase, you're going to have five problems. The two columns are classification of those factors into two separate areas. Either is it a problem for the workout itself? So I've written effect on peri-workout stimulus. I probably should have just written effect on workout itself, but
That's
obviously
fine.
my brain was in technical mode when I wrote this. So the first column is, does it create a problem for the hypertrophy stimulus that I'm actually creating in the workout itself? Very
Hmm.
specific to the workout. The second column is it creating a problem between workouts regarding the atrophy that I'm normally expected to experience? So just let me justify that for people who maybe haven't heard me justify it before. Every time we do a strength training program, you've got a period of maybe 36 to 48 hours after the workout in which you are essentially in an anabolic state. The muscle fibers are growing. As soon as you leave that phase, it will drop just below baseline, or not baseline, so it'll drop below equilibrium point, and you'll notice that you're now in a state of losing that muscle size that you previously gained. And obviously, what we want to do is look at whether caloric restriction or how caloric restriction can create problems for us, both in terms of the hypertrophy stimulus we're creating and also in terms of the atrophy that we are experiencing between workouts. So each of these five areas can be analyzed to see whether it creates a problem for the workout itself, and the period of time between workouts. So hopefully that's a clear presentation of what this is trying to do. So if we start at the very beginning, the first row says reduced baseline net protein balance. That is very, very kind of vague wording because it's a relatively difficult concept to explain because we're never really in protein balance. We're always either in growing or shrinking. So it's really kind of a difficult thing to say. But what I'm saying here is that if you look at a person in caloric restriction or an animal in caloric restriction, then what tends to happen is that their muscle protein synthesis levels and rates at any one moment in time, whether they're in a state of activity or inactivity, it doesn't matter, is always lower than you would predict from an animal or a person who is doing exactly the same thing, but who is actually in caloric balance or calorie balance. So one of the best study groups of this is actually, because let me just give a little bit of a scientific addition to this for people who may be interested in this area. One of the problems with measuring this in people, but especially in animals, is that if you are doing a normal level of physical activity, let's say you've got a mouse that runs on a wheel for a certain amount of time every day, and you standardize that every day for that same amount of running, and the mouse in one group, or the mice in one group, are in calorie balance, and the mice in the other group are in caloric restriction, the mice in calorie balance are going to carry on growing, and the mice in calorie restriction are either going to sort of stay the same size or they're actually going to shrink slightly. If you lose weight, then the amount of motor unit recruitment that you need to achieve the same amount of physical activity reduces. So essentially, if I want to walk across the room and I weigh 80 kilograms, it requires me to exert a certain amount of recruitment to do that. If I weigh 75 kilograms, I use less recruitment to do that. I don't need to be as strong to lift a smaller weight. So what you find is that your actual number of fibers that you're using on a habitual activity basis starts to drop. And of course, unless you're doing strength training, which is a separate question, but just in terms of understanding how these studies work. So some of the best studies control completely for activity levels by just using immobilization. Because then you know that if you've got an animal or a person who's immobilized or bed rest or whatever, then you know activity is zero in the calorie balance group and it's zero in the calorie restricted group. So it's actually really difficult to look at many of these studies if they don't control for physical activity levels really, really precisely, as is the case with immobilization. So if you look at immobilization studies, what you find is that calorie restriction actually accelerates the losses of muscle size in comparison with immobilization without calorie restriction. So it's really interesting just to see how that works. So essentially, the way this is working is a reduction in the muscle protein synthesis levels. So whether we're doing a workout or whether we're in a period of, between workouts, we're always going to have a reduction in the level of muscle protein synthesis. Now, what I've said here is it doesn't actually affect the size of the workout stimulus. And you say, well, how is that the case? Well, it's because the stimulus stays the same size. It's just that if your equilibrium point is here normally, then you essentially get this much muscle protein synthesis above your equilibrium point. If your equilibrium point drops, now the entire thing now drops. You're starting from down here. So you would have to be essentially, you'd have to create a bigger workout stimulus to get to the same point that you would have done in calorie balance. So it's not changing the size of the stimulus, it's just changing where the stimulus is relative to your muscle protein breakdown rates. Because you're always in a state where muscle protein synthesis would be in balance approximately across the week with muscle protein breakdown in a calorie balanced state. If your muscle protein synthesis now drops to here relative to muscle protein breakdown across the week, that will be your calorie restricted state. The workout stimulus can still be this size, but instead of being here, it's now down here. So essentially, it's not changing the magnitude of the stimulus, it's changing where it is relative to your equilibrium point.
So
Either
to
way,
bring it all around, you have less room for error when
much
you're
less
in,
room for error
right.
when you're trying, because essentially what that now means is that your workout stimulus is going to go less far because it's starting further back. Imagine you're doing a 100-meter race and you're now starting 10 meters back before the starting
Hmm.
line from everybody else. You're essentially starting from a point where you're much worse off, and therefore now you can't afford to make any mistakes in your strength training program to maximize the hypertrophy stimulus that you're creating. But it does definitively, obviously, have a net effect on a worse effect on atrophy because we end up
Hmm.
finding that when we're outside of our stimulus period, we're always going to be experiencing a faster rate of atrophy than we would do normally. So we want to make
Hmm.
sure that we're not, kind of spending too much time outside of a stimulus period, which again, as you pointed out a moment ago, means we've got less room for error. We can't do the kind of bodybuilding programs that are very popular. I must say one of the most popular questions I get on my Instagram stories each week when I do them is, how can I make upper lower splits work, uh, better than they do? And I'm like, I just that isn't where I'm at.
by
I think,
by not necessarily doing an upper lower, maybe going full
but
body.
yeah, the
This is
answer is
this
by
is
not doing
something
upper lower
this is something I
splits.
often have to break down when someone comes to me. Maybe someone hasn't worked with someone who subscribes to these beliefs, but I have to break down in real time, at least visually, how the stimulus versus the atrophy period works visually, so that people can understand that once that atrophy begins, you need to create another stimulus. So creating that balance between not exceeding the amount that you can recover from, so that you can train again and create more stimulus, is the magic balance, and something that we're always trying to balance, I guess, especially when in a deficit, because again, there's less room for error, and your risk of
Exactly.
atrophy is going to be so much higher.
Exactly. So we've got some straight away, literally just on the first row. We now know we've got to be very careful about, the nature of the workout that we're doing to maximize the stimulus. We're also going to have to be careful about, avoiding, the lower frequency training programs, making sure that we still, focus on training the muscle frequently throughout the week. Moving
Hmm.
on to the next row, we're also going to find that we get slower recovery from post-workout fatigue. And that's going to affect workout performance. So the reason I put it in this column is because if we turn up to a workout and we're still fatigued from a previous workout, we're going to have a negative effect. So straight away, we know that we're going to need to be careful about post-workout fatigue. And the reason that it's a problem is because MPS, muscle protein synthesis rate, which is suppressed by just being in a caloric restricted state, actually is responsible for the muscle damage repair process as well as the hypertrophy process. So if I have lower MPS, I'm going to have slower recovery from the workout, and I'm going to find that I'm not going to be able to recover from the same number of sets and the same type of exercise that I would do in calorie balance. And we see that reflected in the MPS, we see it reflected in the mTOR signaling data, across the board. We know that, the process of recovery. We see it in the muscle injury data. So one of my favorite ways of just
Hmm.
confirming things is to look at muscle injury that isn't caused by exercise and go, if I'm in a caloric restricted state, does having a non-exercise muscle injury take longer to recover than, it would do if I was in calorie balance? And it does. So we know straight away that it's not necessarily about, the hypertrophy process. It's just about regenerating, repairing damaged muscle fibers, taking longer when you're in a caloric restricted state. So we
I
can't
think
just
that's
carry on with the
sorry.
program we were doing previously.
No, I think that's a good takeaway, that elevated muscle protein synthesis doesn't necessarily translate to hypertrophy stimulus. It's something that a lot of people talk about, especially in the fitness world, I guess, that okay, we got to continually stimulate muscle protein synthesis as if that's the thing that's stimulating hypertrophy, but it's a little more complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, muscle protein synthesis is like traffic on the road. I mean, if there's lots of traffic on the road, it could be going to the same destination as you, or it could be going somewhere completely different. Ultimately, it's just, things are happening, and it could be
Hmm.
repairing the muscle fibers. It could be just, kind of devoted to sarcomerogenesis rather than hypertrophy itself. I mean, there's all
Hmm.
kinds of things that MPS can do. It doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily produce hypertrophy, but in this particular context, what we're interested in is noticing that if you've been doing a particular training program in a calorie balanced state, and then you just think to yourself, oh, well, I'll just drop calories down a bit and then carry on with my same program, it might not work because you might find that if you were close to your kind of limit of what you can recover from, you might find that you now can't recover from that because the processes of repair and regeneration rely on MPS the same way that hypertrophy relies on MPS. So if you're having your MPS suppressed across the board, you will find that you don't recover as quickly as you would do in calorie balance.
Yeah, and if you're noticing a reduction in strength expression, that's a pretty good indication that you're not recovered between sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, physiology is a bit messy, so you can see a little
Mhm.
bit of strength loss from, if you lose water or intramuscular fat, your moment arms will reduce. But
Right.
really, if you can maintain strength in a diet, I think that's a fantastic outcome.
Yeah, agreed.
So the next item is shifting gears a little bit because we're going to now talk a little bit about how the psychological effects are going to impact on us during a dieting situation. I've written just decreased motivation to train because obviously being in a caloric restricted state is going to produce disagreeable sensations. That is basically the definition of something that creates supraspinal central nervous system fatigue. So we are going to find that when we enter into a dieting situation, immediately we're going to find that going to the gym is harder to create maximum levels of motor unit recruitment. And that is then going to reduce our ability to stimulate hypertrophy. It's going to risk losing some of the muscle mass that we gained previously. And the annoying thing about recruitment is if you don't get access to the fibers and they basically just don't get trained, then they're immediately in an atrophy state for multiple days longer than you would hope them to be. And then you're potentially going to lose that size pretty quickly. And it's going to be
Mhm.
difficult to get back unless you can break back into that level of recruitment. So really this is territory where maybe normally you go to the gym and you can be very excited and psyched up and give your best efforts, but maybe when it comes to a diet, suddenly that becomes just very, very different task. That's when you need to look at all the possible ways of increasing motivation, increasing motor unit recruitment in other ways. So, for example, you can change exercise selection like we talked about earlier. You can look at stability. You can look at factors that motivate you, like listening to music, training with a gym partner,
Mhm.
all those kind of things, and literally just go through all the possibilities and try and implement as much of those as are feasible to mitigate these kind of problems. To maximize the stimulus by maximizing the recruitment.
Yeah, one of the biggest issues I run up against, especially with bodybuilders, because they're so well, most of them are focused primarily on aesthetics, is transitioning from a period where they've been massing, where they feel very strong, where visually they feel very big, that intervening period where they're not lean, but they're also very flat because they're, or at least they feel flat by comparison because they're not consuming a bolus of carbohydrates. And these types of motivational factors, the ways that you can increase motivation, are very helpful in just keeping them on track. I think you talked about receiving verbal encouragement, training with a gym partner. A lot of people don't
Totally,
realize, obviously the music aspect is huge, but even tracking, your numbers is hugely motivational.
definitely.
And a lot of individuals, when they first come to me, they don't want to track the numbers until they start to actually see the psychological benefit it has downstream on their training. And it's fun to see that switch flip.
Absolutely. And like things like this isn't going to cover nutrition, this particular webinar, but it's worth noting that, you know, if you go into a workout in a carbohydrate depleted state, you will immediately feel more negative sensations than if you didn't. So,
Mhm.
timing of carbohydrates or maybe using carbohydrate mouth rinsing or something like that to, work around those problems can be really valuable. And that is also something that obviously impacts then on what we just mentioned with post-workout fatigue, because if you're going into workouts in a carb depleted state, you're much more likely to come out of the workout with a lot more post-workout calcium ion related fatigue, which is what
Mhm.
ultimately then leads to muscle damage. So we don't really want to be going into workouts in carb depleted states, not only for the fact that it creates a reduction in recruitment in the workout itself, but also because
Mhm.
it's going to create problems for the post-workout period in terms of recovery. So again, this isn't a nutritional webinar by any means, but just in
No.
terms of understanding the impact of those nutritional decisions on strength training performance and post-workout recovery, it's worth being aware that those factors do play into this matrix. They're not additional to, they feed into the things that we're already describing here.
Mhm. Yeah, it's just to agree with your point further. I think we've spoken in the past to the effect of, okay, if you were given the choice between a slight reduction in net protein balance versus giving an athlete carbohydrates, to uphold training performance, that's a balancing act as well. Because if you just have,
Absolutely,
a lot of
absolutely, very
old
difficult.
school guys are very low carb, basically like carnivore keto, essentially no carbohydrate at all, and performance just plummets. I mean, sure, visually you might get leaner, but eventually, but the risk of atrophy, I think, is with that reduction in training performance doesn't outweigh the benefit, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the very least, if somebody is committed to taking a low carb approach, then I would definitely look at carbohydrate mouth rinsing as a
Hmm.
way to try and at least mitigate some of the supraspinal central nervous system fatigue effects during the workout. I don't think you'll get
Hmm.
around the post-workout muscle damage problem because you're obviously sort of creating more calcium related fatigue, especially on the
Hmm.
excitation contraction coupling side.
Right.
Um, and so that is going to translate to more post-workout fatigue. But I think ultimately, you can potentially mitigate some of the workout performance side of things. Just it's not a complete solution by any means. So that's the motivation side of things. The next item we've got is sleep quality. Now, this is one of those areas that I think is I promised new physiology, so here it is. Okay, so um, I know there's a number of people who are here because I promised new physiology, so I don't want to disappoint them. Um, you will obviously have heard people talking about the importance of sleep for things like recovery and kind of performance and all those things in general terms, but they maybe haven't gone the extra mile to explain what it is we're actually talking about. Well, in terms of the performance side of things, it's actually exactly the same as the motivation reduction that we just talked about. So, if motivation is reduced, you're going to have a problem with supraspinal CNS because you're going to have a disagreeable well, you're either going to have a disagreeable sensation or you're going to have just a plain reduction in motivation. Both of them get you to the same place, which is a reduction in the motor recruitment corresponding to the maximum tolerable perception of effort. A reduction in sleep, decreased sleep quality or actually quantity, will produce the same reduction in the amount of motor recruitment you can generate at maximum tolerable perception of effort. So you will
Hmm.
reduce recruitment at muscular failure. And so you obviously then reduce the amount of hypertrophy stimulus you're going to get. Now, that's not really rocket science at all. There's nothing new there. I'm just covering that off so we're aware that it does create that problem. What I think is new and relevant for people to understand is that if you look at the literature regarding the effects of sleep loss on atrophy, it's different from the literature regarding the effects of caloric restriction on atrophy. And it's actually really interesting to track through those differences because, for example, if you look at sleep loss, you get a preferential reduction in type 2 fiber size that you don't get with caloric restriction. With caloric restriction, you get both type 1 and type 2 fiber size reductions because you're suppressing MPS across the board. With sleep loss, you actually get preferential type 2. So I'm illustrating that just to show you that there are some interesting differences between the way that sleep loss creates atrophy directly and different way from the way that the caloric restriction is doing it. And the reason for that is because sleep loss actually produces a glucocorticoid response. So that's the cortisol that, maybe years ago people used to get very agitated about cortisol levels after strength training workouts. It's like, no, it's not quite the same thing. We're talking about a genuine kind of stressor in the form of, meaningful sleep loss, persistent, kind of sleep loss over a number of days. You're going to find that you get a glucocorticoid increase, circulating glucocorticoids. That's going to produce an increase in oxidative stress, which produces an increase in muscle protein breakdown rates. Now, you can actually track through all of those steps in the physiology, showing how the glucocorticoid response to sleep loss uh, increases oxidative stress inside the muscle fibers, which then increases the rate of muscle protein breakdown. So, what we're seeing then is a different way in which atrophy is being accelerated. And again, so if you remember back, if you were paying attention earlier when I was talking about the scientific aspects of tracking MPS in caloric restriction and showing how immobilization is the best way of doing it because you've got total control over physical activity, you can do the same thing with glucocorticoid responses. So if you look at models or even real situations of traumatic injury. Typically speaking, in traumatic injury, the person who's been injured obviously is in bed rest because they're injured, so they're lying in bed not doing anything. So what you can do is you can measure the muscle protein breakdown rates in the individual who's experienced the injury in bed, and again with somebody else who's a control subject who's not experienced the injury, who is also in bed rest. And what you notice is that muscle protein breakdown rates are faster in the injured person in bed rest compared to the person who is just in bed rest. So what
Mm.
you've got is a magnifying effect on the rate of muscle protein breakdown and the rate of atrophy. Ultimately, this research goes back a very long way into the medical literature, where people would be obviously going to hospital with an injury, and the doctors would be like noticing that the people who are injured and in bed just absolutely lost muscle mass at a silly speed compared to the people who are in for another, kind of just waiting for something else to happen. So like maybe somebody's in bed waiting for an operation and the atrophy rates are way slower than the person who's just been injured and is in bed because they're injured. So these studies, the observation goes back decades, and that original observation fed through into a series of experiments, and people now understand that it's actually the glucocorticoid response which is being generated in that case by the injury, but in our case by the sleep loss. You get the same problem, and you get accelerated atrophy produced by the accelerated muscle protein breakdown rates. So this is really interesting because essentially it's doing something different from what caloric restriction does. So if you're in a situation where you've got caloric restriction and you're also losing sleep, you are in very, very dangerous territory as far as muscle loss is concerned. Because not only have you got a suppression of MPS, you've also now got this acceleration of muscle protein breakdown. So that was, I think, something I just wanted to bring to you guys today, which I don't think is generally discussed, is actually really, really interesting, just showing how sleep is important in this particular situation.
It's very common as well on prep, while bodybuilding preps are in extended deficits for me to see clients with disjointed or dysregulated sleep. So I've had conversations to the effect of, okay, would you rather me get up earlier to do a cardiovascular workout or stay in bed? And to be honest, I'd rather them just get an extra hour. I'm not telling you to
Yeah,
be more lazy, but I'd rather you get a full night of sleep than just, again, it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul, as you said.
it is totally, totally. Super, super important. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, that gives us the answer again to our final row on the chart, which is increased stress levels, for any other reason. So anytime if somebody's doing a competition, they're getting worried about the outcome of that competition, if they're just feeling stress from other life events, whatever it may be, they are going to experience the same two problems that we've seen for sleep loss, which is that we're going to have a reduction in the stimulus of the workout because we're going to have less, kind of ability to create high levels of recruitment. And secondly, we're going to see a accelerated rate of muscle loss because of the increase in glucocorticoid circulation, leading to oxidative stress, leading to accelerated muscle protein breakdown rates. Now, as I say, you can trace all of those things step by step by step. That's not a hand waving kind of explanation. That's literally exactly the 3 steps that we go through. Perhaps if there's an interest, we can do a more deep dive into that at a future date.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just to kind of finalize a comment on that, caloric restriction itself isn't necessarily a stressor, but it can become one. So this is all going to come down to perceptions and how we feel about the situation. So the numbers are going to be different from everybody. But I think it's really interesting that if you look both in the animal literature and in the human literature, that a small caloric deficit of a couple of hundred calories a day doesn't really seem to lead to muscle loss during a strength training program. But if you go above about 500 or, say maybe 20% of normal caloric
Mm-hmm.
intake, you are going to kind of be in risk of a territory where you're going to start to perceive that as a stressor. In the animal literature, you get a similar observation insofar as increasing magnitudes of caloric deficit start to produce glucocorticoid circulations, and again it kind of triggers around the same kind of 20 to 25% marker on normal daily intakes. So and again, you also get the same issue with sustained caloric restriction. So if you do like a day
Mm-hmm.
or two of fasting, it doesn't really trigger the problem. You start to push it out to longer than that, and you start in unhabituated animals. you start to see it triggering a really big glucocorticoid response. So I think what we're seeing generally as a picture here is that caloric restriction isn't necessarily a stressor, so it doesn't necessarily put us in territory where we're accelerating muscle protein breakdown rates, but it can if you don't do it properly. So again, it's like we've got caloric restriction on its own as a row in this model, just creating a reduction in MPS. It doesn't have to also produce an MPB, muscle protein breakdown increase, but it can if you really start to make it not work.
Yeah, and imagine stacking all of these things simultaneously whilst on a poor sleep, decreased motivation, increased psychological stress, a deficit that is too aggressive because you're on a short timeline versus
Because you're
maybe
worried about the
stretching the.
competition coming up, so you're stressed about it. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
this is something I discuss regularly with new people who come to me and they say, I need to compete at this show, and it's maybe 12 or 14 weeks away, and they have a lot of body fat to lose. I'm like, this is gonna suck
Just
for you. You're gonna
pick a different show. Yeah, I
pick a show
mean
further
it's
out, be
yeah,
more sensible. You're going to have a better experience and you're going to get a better physique out of it in the end.
totally, totally. So, summarizing this stuff, what I think we can say is that you've got a number of factors which are going to suppress your ability to create a good stimulus from each workout that you're doing. That's number one point. What that means is you can't make mistakes that you would be able to make normally and kind of muddle through. You really need to get your program dialed in so it really is a good program. And if you're coming at this from the point of view of saying, yeah, but I like training like this, and I like to do this, and I like to do this, I'm like, yeah, but those things aren't, the best way to train, you might have to make some compromise with how you personally really like training to make sure that your program does match up with the best possible stimulus. And you're
Hmm.
also going to have to look at things to help you overcome the challenges of reduced motivation, increased supraspinal CNST. You have to get comfortable with logbook tracking, get comfortable with, making the best of the available strategies for increasing recruitment. At the same time, you're going to have to be trying to make sure that your workout doesn't create a ton of extra fatigue. So again, you can't make mistakes with the program. So in the same way that you can't make mistakes with the program in terms of the stimulus, you can't really make many mistakes in the program in terms of excess post-workout fatigue. So if you're like, oh, but I like doing tons of kind of stretch partials or something like that, it's like, yeah, maybe this is not the time to do that, you know. So kind of got to start to be serious about, how the physiology feeds into the program and making sure that it does the right things for you. And then really the same thing applies for atrophy. It's like, again, people are going, yeah, but I like to train bro split or I like to train upper lower splits. I'm like, yeah, but you're losing a lot. You're leaving a lot on the table by leaving those extra days between workouts. You can't just expect the caloric restriction to behave in the same way as calorie balance. You are going to suffer those negative effects. So we were chatting about how to summarize the entire webinar just before we came on, and I think I would say you just can't make mistakes that you would be able to get away with in calorie balance. You've got to get your program to work properly in the optimal way that does, kind of maximize stimulus, minimize fatigue, and minimize atrophy between training sessions. You can't really kind of sort of skate through things and hope for the best. It's a time when you really need to get dialed in on all of those programming variables.
Yeah, I would also say that just to bring a bit of real world application to that as well is sometimes you're going to have to meet someone in the middle because people are very often times dogmatic to their approaches, and you have to kind of break them in gently, show them that these processes work, and then when they actually start to get a little bit more buy-in, you can maybe transition a little bit more into the stuff that we know physiologically translates to better results because people are oftentimes resistant in the beginning, especially in the bodybuilding space. There's a lot of I guess there's a lot of I don't know which term to use. There's a lot of stuff that goes around that maybe isn't always as efficacious as people would first believe when they hear it. Sounds great on
Yeah,
paper, but it's not
totally.
actually how it applies in.
Totally. But that's one of those things that, we were talking about the other day, how you described how, like a couple of years ago, when you started implementing some of these
Mhm.
ideas into your programs for your clients, initially it was a lot harder because the whole industry didn't really accept it at all a couple of years ago. And now
No.
many of the things we're talking about are so much easier to introduce in training programs than they used to be because people are starting to accept some of this stuff. I think I think we're sailing with the wind now. A
Hmm.
couple of years ago, when I was introducing this stuff to people, I was definitely sailing against the wind, and it was like people just didn't want to hear it. Now I think we're kind of got the benefit of, you know, a more receptive audience to these ideas. So, hopefully
Yes.
people will be able to implement some of this stuff more easily than it was for us back in the
Yeah,
day.
I have countless examples, with natural athletes who've come from older disciplines who've implemented some of these processes, and they've either come onto the stage more muscular, or they don't feel like they're dead, 6 to 8 weeks
Yeah,
out, which was
totally,
what it was previously, where they're just every day is a struggle. They can't reach the same numbers in the weight room that they could previously, and
totally.
limiting these fatigue mechanisms in between workouts and during the workouts has had a dramatic effect, not only on their physique, but also on their enjoyment of the process. And if that's not a win, I don't know what is.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I think that's been a good summary of what we've covered today. Shall
Hmm.
we open the chat up for questions and we'll see what we can do for people's
Yeah.
curiosity?
Yes. Let me just do that. Okay.